Welcome to the Spice Review for the economic theme. Again, I'll be going through this video pretty quickly. Feel free to stop it if you need to, and you'll be pausing at the end of each unit to write main idea statements. Here's some things we look at with the economic theme in general. How food is produced, trade, labor, and then later, of course, in the course, industrialization and globalization. These are the basic topics for Unit 1. Again, it's migration and the development of the first 6 civilizations. Not a whole lot going on here. It is important to remember that the hunter-gatherer societies in the Paleolithic era did exchange and trade with their neighbors. They were not true islands not connected to anybody else. And also, of course, trade expanded throughout this period. Two examples are between the Egyptian and Nubian civilizations. Remember, the Egyptian civilization is centered up here around the Nile, and Nubia is farther up the Nile. And then over here in the Middle East between Mesopotamia and the Indus River Valley, which are the societies in this direction in what is present-day India. So go ahead and write a main idea statement for Unit 1, just based on these two bullets. For Unit 2, we're looking at the classical era. The empires, such as the Han Dynasty and the Roman Empire, definitely relied on facilitating trade in order to survive. There's a couple of examples here about building roads, and here's a diagram of the roads in the Roman Empire, and also the Royal Road in the Persian Empire, and issuing currency such as these Roman coins here. They also relied on a range of labor systems. Corvée is a system of labor in which instead of paying taxes, the citizens of a country are required to provide labor to the government, and the Great Wall of China was built that way, and that is shown here on the map in this dotted line. Slavery, of course, paying rent and tribute, communities of peasants that produce food primarily, and also, of course, production on a smaller scale in households. So we're going to get into the trade networks here. Remember, your book started in Chapter 8 with the trade networks, which technically was the beginning of Unit 3. But the major networks, like the ones shown on the bottom here, especially the first 4, were all starting during the classical era. So this is what you need to know for each of them, where they were, what they traded, and who was involved. Starting with the Silk Roads, there are of course caravans across the desert, shown on the red lines here. Remember that they focused on luxury goods that were small and expensive and could be carried on the backs of camels. And some of the states and empires that were involved in them are listed here. China, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Byzantine Empire, and the Mongols. And make sure your geography is clear, that we have China on this end, we have the Byzantine Empire on this end, the Caliphates, of course, are down here in the Arabian Peninsula, and then the Mongol Empire at its height in the 13th century controlled much of the middle. Excuse me. For the Trans-Saharan, of course, there are also caravans, items like gold, salt, slaves, and ivory. The Mediterranean regions, such as Islamic states like the Abbasid Caliphate, who controlled northern Africa, are linked to the West African states like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. Check the dates for those states so you know that when they popped up, because they were not there all the time. And when the Abbasid Caliphate began, you're not necessarily looking at all 3 of those West African states. In the Indian Ocean, remember the technology that helped facilitate trade across the open ocean. More bulk goods that fit on large cargo ships. And some of the states here, China, of course, India being kind of at the center of the trade. The Swahili city-states are down here in Eastern Africa. And of course, Islamic traders were very involved in this trade, and they spanned from the Arabian Peninsula all the way to Southeast Asia. Make sure you're not confusing the Swahili city-states and the East African societies, which facilitated Indian Ocean trade, with the West African societies that facilitated Trans-Saharan trade. They're separate trade routes, so the West African societies never connect directly with the Indian Ocean trade. The Mediterranean sea lanes really are a connection from these same 2 trade networks. And so we have many of the same guys involved with the Mediterranean. And for the American trade networks, Teotihuacan was a major trading city in what is present-day Mexico. There's a list of some things they traded here. And then, of course, they traded with the Mayan territory. And then over here in Cahokia, we have a large trade network centered roughly around the Mississippi River Valley. And that's the end of Unit 2. Write a main idea statement for these topics. For Unit 3, we have intensifying and expanding trade networks and empires. One of the things you need to know about is some trading cities that flourished during this time, and there's a list of some cities here that go along with the trade networks that they were involved with. Many of these were mentioned in your textbook, so it just helps to focus on them as the rise of cities. Trade was facilitated by these financial tools. A bill of exchange is sort of like a check. It's like an IOU. We have banks beginning to flourish at this time period. Essentially, these are tools that make it so the traders don't have to carry large amounts of cash, and that so they can easily trade with people whose economies might be based in different countries. New state practice like minting of coins and paper money, which was developed in China, as shown on the map here, and also infrastructure projects that produce a lot of jobs, which creates economic growth, and also the projects themselves are designed to facilitate trade, like the Grand Canal, in China, shown here in the blue lines, which connected major river systems. Trade across the Eurasian landmass was facilitated by these empires. So kind of review these things. We've talked a lot about the Mongols doing that and the caliphates, of course. And we have some note card terms like the Byzant for Byzantine Empire, which was the universal currency. And then there's a section in Chapter 9 about the Tang and the Song dynasties for China. China, Persia, and India were all known for their industrial production. And when we say industrial for this time period, we mean a kind of a uniform way of producing things. We don't mean factories and steam engine powered machines, but textiles and porcelains, and then iron and steel specifically in China. So labor organization, this is a big continuity from the previous unit, so pretty much the same things here. Nomadic pastoralism. Remember, the guilds were largely produced in Europe, and those are kind of trading organizations based around a certain job or a certain trade. And coerced labor is going to continue, as are taxes and military obligations. Some of the new forms of coerced labor were the mita in the Incan Empire, and serfdom in Europe and Japan, which is essentially the labor system associated with feudalism, which is more of a political system. The serfs being the peasants who are essentially tied to the land and have to produce for the lords. And then demand for slavery is going to increase. And in this time period, we have not gotten to the Columbian Exchange yet, so we're not talking about the slave trade across the Atlantic Ocean. But in these places listed here, there is an increase in demand for slavery, largely because of an increase in economic production. So write a main idea statement for these topics for Unit 3. For Unit 4, we will have the Columbian Exchange, and that's, of course, going to have a lot of economic impact. But first, we have the Portuguese. Remember, they found a route around the tip of Africa. Portugal will be right up here, so they navigate down along this way and eventually over here. And on this map, we have the Portuguese trading post empires. And those would be in orange on this map, and there's some of these little cities here along the coast of India. And that was the first direct European presence in Asia for trade, which prompted the Spanish, in order to compete with the Portuguese, to sponsor Columbus, who, of course, sailed to the west and bumped into the Americas. At this point, remember that what the Europeans are doing in Asian trade is kind of acting as the middlemen. So they're buying goods in Asia and either selling them to other goods or in the Indian Ocean region. And now we have the silver trade, which helped to create a global currency and facilitated global trade, shown on the routes here in red. So joint stock companies, I don't know that the book used this term very much. Essentially, it's a company authorized by a European government to conduct trade on the behalf of the government. As far as the Europeans are concerned, like let's say the British government, that company has a monopoly in the place that they're trading in. So the ones you did learn about were the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company. And so from the standpoint of those European governments, those companies had a monopoly for trade in India and of course made them quite wealthy. And this is an extension of the policy of mercantilism, enriching the mother country. In the Atlantic system, this is a name for the trade side of the Columbian Exchange. We have the exchange of goods in both directions, and of course unfree laborers, that would be the slave trade. And for free laborers, they're referring to migration. And of course there's a cultural mixing that happens as well. So peasant labor, the example we're going to use for that is that the fur trade in Yasak in Russian Siberia. This map kind of shows this expansion of Russia over time, And remember, the reason Russia expands all the way in this direction is because Siberia here is really where the fur is, and that was referred to as sometimes soft gold, and of course made quite a bit of money for the empire. For Africa, slavery continues, and slaves, in addition to the transatlantic slave trade, slaves are still exported to the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean, and that's shown on these lines here. See, it says other slave trade routes, so kind of pay attention to that. And the red, of course, is a new development, which is shown here on this map. For some of the effects in Africa, it did cause African population to slow down or in some places drop because so many men especially were removed from society, but also women as well. Remember that the Americas economy is agricultural at this time, and it's based on a plantation economy, and slavery is the labor system. And it's especially true in the sugar plantations in the Caribbean and in Brazil, but also throughout the American South and in much of what is now the Latin American countries in South America. When the Spanish arrived, they did change the labor systems, and they set up something called the hacienda system, and that is essentially coerced labor created by the Spanish colonists, and that, in the case of the Inca region, is a change from the Mita system into a new system of forced labor. Indentured servitude is another form of what we would call semi-coerced labor. Remember, indentured servants are technically not slaves, but they're tied to the land and not allowed to leave for a certain amount of time. This one has got a lot going on, so we're going to have you write two main idea statements. Two more units. Unit 5 is the industrialization one, so of course this will have a lot of economic stuff going on. The factory system, the big change here is that labor is concentrated in one place and people begin to specialize. So instead of producing goods at home and kind of creating everything from clothes and food to furniture, people have a single job and they work in a factory, let's say producing clothes, some kind of textile, and that's all they do all day long, and they don't have the skills to produce anything else, and they need money from their job to pay for everything else. And that's the big change that industrialization creates in terms of how work is done. So the spread of industrialization, remember it started in Britain, then went to northwestern Europe, especially Germany, then to other parts of Europe, the United States, and then Russia and Japan. And this kind of goes in order of time. And remember, Japan and Russia, we're talking about late 19th century probably. By 1900, all of these places are industrialized, but at varying degrees. So the book talks about the second industrial revolution. Excuse me. And this is about 100 years after industrialization started, and we have the production of steel, which is going to make skyscrapers and railroads possible, more chemicals that are used in manufacturing. Electricity becomes an energy source instead of coal-burning steam engines. And then, of course, machinery becomes more precise. This eventually is going to lead to the automobile and the airplane, for instance. Export economies. So we have now, by this time, by the early 1800s, the American colonies, for instance, have their independence. And this map here shows the Latin American region, and all these symbols show examples of of goods that they exported. There's a list here on the left. Basically, an export economy means a large portion of a country is completely dependent on producing one thing that they sell. Most of these items, like cotton, rubber, and sugar, are used in industrial, either food production or clothing production for industrialized countries. So it's one of the reasons the Latin American societies, to pick an example, are later to industrialize. Because of industrial production, agricultural economies are going to decline. India, for instance, as we saw in an earlier unit and region, had been producing for cotton for a long time, and British industrial production is going to overtake them. The British essentially can produce more at a cheaper rate, and so India's economy is transformed in this way. If you're going to industrialize, you need places to sell your items. So it causes the British and other European countries to look for new markets. For instance, China. This is going to lead to the Opium Wars and spheres of influence after the Treaty of Nanjing, and the first kind of inklings of imperialism. There were mining centers. This is not emphasized as much in the book, but the diamond mines in South Africa are an example of tools and resources the Europeans used. Stock markets and insurance were helping to produce economic growth at this time. A stock is a way that a company can borrow money from people. When you buy stock in a company, you're buying a share in that company's profits. And that fueled the growth of industrial economies by providing money to invest in your business. And insurance is a new development that allows companies to take reasoned risk knowing that they'll be paid back if something goes wrong. So transnational corporations like the United Fruit Company become prevalent at this time period, and they are related, maybe from a synthesis standpoint, to those joint stock companies in that they're pretty much representing the needs and goals of a country from an economic standpoint, even though it's a private company. So laissez-faire capitalism and free trade are kind of the theoretical underpinnings of all this industrial growth and development. There's the names of two people here, Adam Smith for capitalism and John Stuart Mill for liberalism. And basically the idea is that there should be little or no government control over the economy, that private investors and entrepreneurs are motivated by profit to make all these changes happen. This is kind of the opposite economic philosophy of communism, which says the state should direct these things and everyone should, share everything. In response to some of the problems that industrialization created, workers did organize themselves. In places like the United States and Britain, labor unions were a key component of that. In other places, especially, of course, Russia, socialism and Marxism are key factors. I was going to say in China, but since we're talking about industrial states, I wouldn't say China, because remember at the time of the Communist Revolution in China, which is not till the later part of the first half of the 20th century, maybe 1930s and 40s, China is an agricultural society still. So during the time of European influence, there is an issue for states like the Qing dynasty and the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East about confronting that. There were efforts to modernize and reform the economies. So we have Tanzimat in the Ottoman Empire and the self-strengthening movement in the Qing dynasty. But in those countries, remember, those were not always popular. There were often traditionalists who resisted the attempts to westernize the economies or even the cultures of those countries. There was a method of a state-sponsored sort of capitalist version of industrialization. So the Meiji Restoration and the reforms to encourage Western-style industrialization are an example of that. In Tsarist Russia, this is under the monarchy before the Communist Revolution, the government sponsored the building of railroads and factories. And that is a contrast to what happened in countries like the United States, where that was done privately. And then, of course, China's self-strengthening movement is also a government-sponsored industrialization program. So imperialism, from an economic standpoint, not necessarily political just yet. Some observers of what the United Fruit Company did said it was basically economic imperialism because the United States exerted so much economic control over that region. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the Opium Wars in China. Economic imperialism would just mean that you are using your power to create economic benefit for your own country. So obviously the opium trade benefits Britain and other Western countries at the expense of China. There was widespread migration during this time period, and this kind of reviews the reason that happened. Sometimes that was voluntary, just searching for labor and a job. And sometimes it was coerced, such as slavery, semi-coerced, such as indentured servitude. You may know that the colony of Australia was originally founded as a prison colony, and so there were convicts who were sent to work there. And there was seasonal migration. This map on the right shows Japanese agricultural workers who returned to Japan after the growing seasons. So there's a lot going on here. Write two main idea statements and be strategic about how you group those. Finally, for Unit 6, we have the 20th century to the present, and a lot of continuities happening here. So the communist and socialist movements were, the big story economically in the first half of the 20th century and beyond. So we start with Russia and China. These movements in Africa and Asia and Latin America often have a Cold War component to them. So after World War II especially, remember, and this will be in a different presentation, but politically, Africa and Asia got independence from imperialism starting around the 1950s or so. And those new governments were searching for, a new structure. And economically, some of them were moving towards communism and thinking of choosing communism. And so that was a big component of the Cold War. Korea and Vietnam are the two most famous examples of Cold War episodes related to economic decisions. And they were seen as a way to redistribute land. Imperialism, from an economic standpoint, was very much in favor of the elites, and there were certainly leaders who believed that communism was the solution to those issues that were created by imperialism. So we have some new institutions, and these are largely post-World War II institutions in an effort to create some kind of a global community that can foster economic development. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank both loan monies to developing countries to help expand and develop their economies. And typically, remember, those are what we call neoliberalism-based principles, free trade. So the catch for getting this great deal and loaning money to your country is that you cannot put up trade barriers. So economic globalization has been fueled by these organizations that have spread free market principles. There were some, at the same time that globalization is happening, there were some what we call regional trade blocs. NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and that's a no-tariff policy between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. The European Union also, following World War II, created its own trading bloc, and we have global trade, of course, but we have some places where a group of countries are coming together to try to make it even more advantageous for them. So the successor in the globalization era of the transnational corporation is the multinational corporation. The idea with these is that they're so powerful that in some cases they're even more powerful than the countries they organize in. So Royal Dutch Shell is one example of those. In Nigeria, which is a large oil producing country, they have had quite a bit of influence politically over what goes on there. So that's what we mean by a multinational corporation, is that it's politically powerful in those countries as well. And there were some movements to protest with the perceived inequalities of the globalization era from an economic standpoint. And chapter 24 talks about some protests at a meeting of the World Trade Organization as an example of that. So I think one main idea statement is good for here. Conceptually, there's a lot of continuities in terms of global trade, industrialization. There are some regional developments. Industrialization in Unit 6 spreads to places like Africa and Asia. But you can definitely look for continuities going back to Unit 5. For your main idea, make sure you just focus on this. That's the review for economic theme. Happy studying!